Great. So thanks, Diana, and thanks for having us on this panel today. My company, StrongBlock, has been working on governance primarily, and blockchain governance specifically for the last several years, working with a number of different protocols, helping them out, but not necessarily building our own protocol. We're agnostic for that. But in that process, we were looking at a lot of different things here. And so without setting too many ground rules about what is DeFi, what is sustainability, what is governance, I think the best way to do it is to say, well, DeFi right now, in my opinion, is in its infancy. If it were a meal that you were going to, remember when we used to go out to eat? If it were a meal that you were going to, this would be maybe an hors d'oeuvre and an appetizer, something like that. We're really not into the point yet where we're actually getting some sustainable DeFi approaches. If you've seen, there's a chart that got circulated earlier this week. Actually, it's Tuesday, so yesterday, and it showed all the DeFi protocols that are out there right now and their returns and the price of their token, which in most cases is down between 70 and 90% from its launch. So this is a very young time to do it. But what I've seen and what we've seen, because we have a DeFi protocol as well, what we've seen is huge interest in doing this for the money. Right now, it's all about the money, and it's better yields than you can get from your bank. You can get nothing from your bank. And so that's why we're all involved in DeFi in the first place, is that there is a way to take, I would say that the hors d'oeuvre part of DeFi is literally, the hors d'oeuvre part is you have a bunch of altcoins lying around around your house that you can't do anything with. And you went to Compound or some other place and you were able to turn them into some other altcoins that you may have lying around the house. And maybe at some point you'll actually turn it into something that's actually fungible out there, which would be Ethereum or Bitcoin. Absolutely. So that's the DeFi part, right? So it has to grow up a bit more, but the returns, if you don't get crushed, rug pulled, wrecked, all the other things that are happening to people out there, if you're willing to take the risk, the returns clearly are better than your bank, but they're unsecure and you have a lot of potential risk, not just in the contract, the smart contract risk. If people put a smart contract out that has a hole in it that hasn't been audited, risk of the protocol deflating, all the various or inflating, all the other different risks out there. And the next step in that, from what we've seen, is to go towards governance. So we've been, as I said, looking at governance for quite a while. So what is governance? The way that we look at it for DeFi, what we've seen is that most people, like any other democracy where you vote, don't really want to participate, especially with DeFi. They really just want to know, well, if I vote, will it help me get more money?
Exactly.
And so we're in the early stages of governance in DeFi as well. What we really want to be able to look at, and what we're trying to do, is come up with sustainable models that support a larger ecosystem where your participation not only gets you things, gets you money, but also helps one or more other causes. And that's how we believe it will become sustainable, is in the middle of DeFi. There are a number of organizations that I've seen that have different kinds of banking. For example, you have a checking account, but you decide that 1% of the fees are going to go, or 10% of the fees are going to go to a worthy cause. So that's a way to be able to make it work. Those are the simple early parts of governance. Getting more complicated in governance is, well, now that you're able to tweak all those things, what gets people active? What allows them to participate? What makes them want to come back and do governance and not just collect their next altcoin, cash it in for Ether, Bitcoin, and leave? Those are the things.
About incentive structures, right?
Yeah, yes, incentive structures. And so what are those incentive structures? Because most people, even now, people can contribute, and a lot of people want to contribute and get money for doing good, for helping with the public good. So that's really where all of this is going, is that we go from hors d'oeuvres to salad to main course to dessert in the full meal of DeFi. And it's being able to participate, being able to get the money that you expected, your returns, your rewards, but also being able to help one or more causes in that part. And then that lays the groundwork for what are those causes and what is essentially, what is ESG? How does that really work in the real world? And how do we bring that to decentralized
really
finance?
important to be realistic.
Yeah, and so what we found with governance, and how am I doing on time here?
Let's give it like 30 more seconds.
Okay, great. I want to make sure.
Talk a little bit more about transparency and governance as well.
Yeah. So that's the last part of this, is that the transparent part is that what governance parameters can you put on chain to get people to both participate, allow for transparent changes that affect everybody in a positive way. How do you then incentivize people to participate in that kind of governance? Do they care? We're finding a lot of those things is that it's very, very early on blockchain, on-chain governance, but the seeds have been sown.
Right. I love what you're saying, David, in terms of introducing the concept of ESG. Even in traditional finance, ESG is a huge topic and a huge question mark in that, as investors are increasingly interested in investing sustainably, is to have the right metrics and to have the right quantifiable measures in order to be able to compare across investments and have a certain level of analysis when you're analyzing portfolios or opportunities. I'm going to turn it to Anton. And when we talk about ESG, it's a very wide-ranging topic, right? We already talked about governance here, which is fantastic. Now, turning it to financial inclusion, and you have experience with emerging markets. And how can your product, which is basically a wallet and a debit card, for instance, be best positioned to again, be realistic and solve real world problems? We know, for example, that financial inclusion, there was a lot of hype and excitement about financial inclusion at different times in the early days of Bitcoin and in the early conversations about Libra, but we also know that it's important to, like, people in emerging markets, they need access to water, they need access to jobs, they don't need access to crappy ICOs, and we don't want to repeat that again. So how do we leverage access to really networks of productivity and growth through DeFi networks and ecosystems to leverage that?
Sure, thanks, Anna. I'll try to be very short. Finance inclusion, well, financial inclusion has been my pain point ever since I started my career in banking. That is actually the reason why I left my job in banking, and also a story of how later crypto, right, and DeFi became the epicenter of the projects and products that I'm working on. Many of us here are familiar with Austrian economy school, and without boring details, and we don't have time to that, there's a very interesting notion there that the value of the global GDP is actually quadratically correlated to the number of economically involved people. Basically, what it means is that financial inclusion, it literally means that the more people can transact globally and interact with each other, the better it is for everyone. So, but as you said, lyrics aside, the reality is much, much more tough. To me, wallets, debit cards, those are just instruments to achieve the ultimate, which is full self-financial control and an ability to give a user full spectrum of options to easily manage their money. And that's why, in Hollyhill, we are very customer-centric around providing the most optimal, yield strategies for the users, providing access to the most advanced features that other great companies are building. The main job is literally abstracting that complexity of the technology and wrapping it in the convenient access layer. My experience in building consumer finance companies focused on financial inclusion is rough. I've been in the space for quite a long time, and it's very, very, very tough path from regulatory approach to the last mile issue. But at the same time, it's a huge opportunity. DeFi is, its global permissionless system of networks, I would say, provides unbeatable technological access. Access to features that have never been available to consumers before. Money Lego that we're building can be shaped around any consumer need and request, and that's the beauty of it. So, lastly, just to finish off, going back to your question around inclusivity, being realistic, you see, financial inclusion is not just about the infrastructure layer. If it was that simple, it should have been resolved like years, a while ago. It is also not just about the regulations. We all remember BitMEX news from the last week. We also all remember the FCA news here in the UK that just came up, literally hours ago. It's not about being protective or being preventative legislation, rules or opportunities there. I think that we're still just in the discovery phase where the technology layer is available, and there's so many, fantastic opportunities there. It's just that there's, it is for us to decide how to efficiently apply all the available technology that we have in the benefit of many and not few. Right.
There's a very human component, and here we talk about being human-centered, right? when we're talking about very, very complex issues that touch upon many, many, many problems in different societies around the world. Building on what you said and keeping it global, small businesses around the world really need access to financial services. It's been a problem that we've viewed consistently. And today, 99% of companies worldwide are SMEs, and they actually generate 2/3 of all jobs around the world. Yet SMEs have not benefited as much from the current fractional banking system, which is why it opens the opportunity for alternative systems. And turning it to Kain and discussing how can liquidity pools like Synthetix, again, leverage existing networks to meet real needs in alternative ways that existing structures have not been able to meet.
So I think, the interesting thing about DeFi is that at its core, it's about participation, right? It's about, enabling people to have a say in how these systems are coordinated, right? And so when you look at, these obviously very nascent protocols that are being built that are enabling, new ways of coordinating people, it's the key kind of component, I think, is lowering barriers to entry, right? ESG and TradFi, I think, is still a very unsolved problem because, in some senses, it's like oil and water, right? You're trying to like combine these two things that really don't necessarily go together as well as we might like, right? And the question of why do we need to do that? Like, why do we need to kind of inject sustainability into traditional finance? Really comes down to who's in control of it, and at the moment you have very large gatekeepers and high barriers to entry for anyone participating in finance at all, right? You can consume finance, you're allowed to be a consumer of finance, but you're not allowed to necessarily be a producer or participate in financial infrastructure or, even direct how it's created or governed, right? Maybe you can get out your Apple shares and, do a proxy vote or whatever, but you're not really having, any impact on how, any of these large corporates are governed. So I think the interesting thing about DeFi is that it really flattens the structure of how these networks are governed and how participation happens, right? And you have much more inclusive pool of people that are directing them, which means that ideally you should have much better outcomes, right? You should have, if all of the people who are both participating and consuming the services are participants and have a seat at the table, you should end up with better outcomes, and you should have more sustainable infrastructure as opposed to having these large gatekeepers. So I think that for small businesses that are consuming finance at the moment, they're just consumers, to be able to both direct and participate in the infrastructure and protocols that they are consuming is a very powerful thing. And that's ideally where we want to get to with DeFi. We're not quite there yet. There's still a long way to go. We need infrastructure to be able to support that, but we are getting closer. And I think it's something that is going to be really, really positive, because these are people that have just been excluded from participating in governance and participating in these systems for all of history today.
Right. And I love what you say in terms of that they know their problems, and if they have a say in being able to solve those problems, it can be much more effective through the concept of maybe crowdsourcing solutions and building together as a community.
That's, anyone in DeFi can just turn up and take existing infrastructure, existing protocols, and mash them up together to come up with a different product that supports them, right? You just can't do that in traditional finance. It's not possible. Yeah. You can't just turn up and say, "Hey, bank, I'd like to create this other product that would really help me." There's no mechanism by which you can even engage in that conversation.
Precisely.
I guess a perfect example would be Curve and Swerve, for instance. That's the power of open source, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's been the open source thing, Kain and Anton. I love what's going on there, and that there is much more participation, and you're seeing so many things that are literally clones of the previous version, and people get more and more participation.
Right. No, building on the concept of crowdsourcing, we have a great example with Luuk, and hi. and Curacao, we have a new panelist. Luuk and Curacao. Basically, the concept, let's turn it over to the Caribbean and the region of the Caribbean, where we know that Caribbean nations, for example, struggle with huge energy costs across the board. And that has made the region a very clear target for renewable energy projects and sustainability projects across the board, because energy touches so many different concepts. At the same time, again, we're touching the concept that the value of local knowledge to address domestic issues is paramount for any effective implementation of solutions. Because without local input, for example, a large company or a traditional finance institution may not effectively solve the problems in a very specific way, because it may not understand the culture or the norms or the procedures to change that. And Luuk, how has your experience with Curacao, and you're going to tell us a little bit more about it, but basically it's crowdsourcing solutions for sustainability in Curacao, and leveraging localized knowledge to meet these needs in the most effective ways.
Yeah, thank you for that intro, Diana. So I think I'm going to build up on what the other panelists already said. So the infrastructure is what we're really missing in Curacao. We are not even allowed to participate in the current financial system. We have a so-called dollar-pegged currency. So our local currency is pegged to the dollar, which is great for stability because we have a small nation, only 160,000 people. So we don't have a large enough economy to create a stable currency. But because we have this dollar-pegged stablecoin, we also have all the regulations from the US. We need correspondent banks in the US to do international transactions. And one of the byproducts of that is that we, for example, don't have PayPal and all these regular payment services that any first world country has. Although our infrastructure, so technology-wise and regulatory-wise and education-wise, is very much first world, our financial system is still greatly excluded. And we also, as a community, because we're a tight-knit community, but we do not have control over our financial situation, because we always need to get the dollars in first before we can mint our own currency. So that's also a huge problem, not only for the energy sector, which, by the way, is a government monopoly, so there's not enough freedom to iterate on that. But what we started to do with Curacao almost 1.5 years ago, we deployed a social impact DAO as an experiment to see if the local community can leverage these DAO infrastructures. We use the DAO stack DAO, by the way, to coordinate on these issues that they have locally. So first of all, identifying what they want to solve, then pooling proposals together like, hey, I'm going to do ABC, and funding it together through the DAO. So during that initial pilot, which lasted for about 6 months, we had some interesting proposals, one of which was a group of 60 teenagers who wanted to create a traditional foundation, but they were too young. And they weren't able to get funds in because they were even too young to create a bank account. And their best shot was coming to us to get $200 to organize a big beach cleanup with 60 individuals. And these are the kind of financial interactions that create a lot of value locally for a very low cost, but just because of the frictions of the traditional system, they're not able to get there. Now, of course, the trust aspect of crypto and DAOs, and especially DeFi, being able to see where money flows, that's a really big, that's really big for countries where trust is very low. People don't trust the government, they don't trust each other. They need to have this verification in place to be like, hey, my money is being used well, and I'm feeling good about my money being here. So we took it a step further, and we leveraged the DeFi infrastructure to create a similar currency as our local guilder, but then backed with DAI. So we call it CuraDAI, and it has the same value as the local guilder. It basically mimics this whole wrapping of a dollar and then creating this guilder. But now we are in charge. We can get the dollars in, we can create the currency ourselves, and we can also unwrap it again to participate in this larger ecosystem of DeFi. So in practice, what that means, if someone would, for example, one of the projects we really did during COVID was a food forest, because almost 50% of the country lost their job because we're heavily reliant on tourism. And also 50% of the country was reliant on food aid because they didn't have enough food. So we funded or co-funded a food forest with CuraDAO, and all the volunteers or contributors even that participated in the creation of the food forest, they got some CuraDAI, which they can then again spend at the food forest to purchase food. And in the current iteration, the Cura DAI is 100% backed by DAI, but we're already in conversation with Will Ruddock from Grassroots Economics in Kenya, who uses a bonding curve to create a stablecoin. And in that way, we can really create what we call a regenerative economy. It even goes beyond sustainability. We can get, let's say, $1,000 of value in, and we can leverage that to create $5,000 of impact on the ground. And I think leveraging these pieces of infrastructure and really maximizing what we have learned in these experiments that seem like crazy Ponzi schemes, but there's a lot of value in these initiatives. Yeah, I think it's been a great experience to test it out locally. And I think the next step for DeFi as an industry to become more sustainable is, first of all, maybe me as a Gen Z, it's super weird to talk about traditional finance, and that we need to emphasize even that your financial decision should be based on the environment and social and governance. Like, these are things that to me seem like a given that should be the foundation of any good infrastructure.
Well, that's the case increasingly for younger and younger investors, right? There's an increasing awareness of sustainability and environmentalism, whereas in older generations that awareness wasn't expressed in the same ways, or it wasn't outright in the same ways. And we're seeing this in a huge way across the board in traditional finance. I wanted to maybe like ask a question to all of you and maybe have a short discussion for the next few minutes on the value of metrics and comparability, and how could we take something like Luuk's very localized project where it's very easy to implement it, and it's very important to pilot and see the results from the beginning and in a small context. But how can we devise metrics in order to make something more I guess more comparable across the board and more I guess more reliable, quote unquote, in larger spaces?
For scalability, I think
exactly. That's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, what Luuk has talked about, and bravo for what you're doing. That's just an amazing idea, and to see it actually working and have the idea using bonded curves and all the other stuff. You're literally taking DeFi and putting it into the real world. That's amazing. So Diana, your question, I think, is how do we scale that? How do we get more participants? And I think it's going to be very community driven. Mm-hmm. I think that we're going to have to do it community by community. So you have everybody has some skin in the game participating in the community, and then you have things like bonded curves that allow people to have some sort of a bank there that pegs things to each other, so that there's the tokens or the coin or whatever that they're getting is actually fungible. They can go out there and do something with it.
And that's
so
your point about incentives.
Yeah, incentives. And so that's, but I actually really applaud what Luuk is doing, because I think that it is going to happen via communities and specialized communities. And then I don't know if there's any worldwide way to do this and get everybody participating without starting with communities first.
Right. And along the lines of starting with communities first, also thinking about indicators. I used to work for the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and it was a very core part of the design of every single project, even though it was the investment banking side of things and we were financing private institutions. There was always an ESG component, and it was very important to measure results. And the only way to measure results over time is to incorporate the right indicators from the beginning, from the design of the project, from the very conception. So what are your thoughts about that, and how can DeFi, I guess, because of the quantification of things and the incentive structures, lead to effective indicators and the project design with this in mind?
I think it's still the private sector, which is obviously us, that will play an important role in redefining business, as usual. And there's a thing there about helping to support the transition from exploitation to restoration. And exploitation of what, you may ask. So anything from from the nature, right, or like to consumers. I think that DeFi allows us to create this idea of sustainable finance around creating sustainable unit economics models. So the very first thing that we see that's going to transition is where there's going to be a bunch of companies that will follow the fair revenue models, right? So not the fair like launch, which is another different space, but fair revenue models that benefit users at first. And then that's the goal, right, of making this internet economy easy and available to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, I think in terms of metrics, one of the challenges is that, you need something that is both pushing in the direction that you want, right? But is also something that can, be clearly compared across not just, individual companies, but industries and more globally. And I think markets are very good at doing that. But when you don't have market forces, for example, like, carbon credits, things like that, right? Like if you don't have some kind of market force to define what a price is, then it's very difficult to compare these things, right? They become kind of intangible positive externalities. And I think that that's something that, DeFi has the potential to change if we can create markets for some of these positive externalities. And, whether that's through DAOs or, through some other structure, I'm not sure, but I think getting the infrastructure into people's hands and, making it clear to them that they can actually start to build financial infrastructure, because people have an assumption that you just can't do this. If you look at the stuff that Luke's been doing, unless you're highly technical, you're deep in the space, you probably have an assumption that you can't go and do all of the stuff that he's been doing in Curacao, right? And not every local community has a Luuk out there to go and help coordinate these things, right? So I think that getting the tools into people's hands, making the infrastructure accessible is really critical, and then we can let things proliferate, and there'll be a whole bunch of experimentation. But that's the kind of key thing.
Yeah, DAO in a box. We need a DAO in a box that you can literally just pull off the shelf and get it going in your community. And I love what you said about positive externalities, because that's what carbon credits has had some issues with, is it's negative externalities that you're being taxed for and traded on. And so the positive externalities is really the key to DeFi, is get people involved early. So it's great ideas.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking about networks and ecosystems and as a way of scaling and growth, and Luke's project in Curacao. I mean, you're having conversations with Kenya now, right?
Yeah, they did mention that, but our agriforestry guy, he just passed a proposal in Curacao to go to Will Ruddock in Kenya to do kind of a knowledge exchange between his project with Sarafu Credit, which has about 25,000 users, I believe. It's running on Extra right now, and they have most of it figured out. Where we hope to get, and we're doing kind of a knowledge exchange where we teach them food forestry, and they hopefully come to Curacao next year to help us working on the next iteration of Curacao, which is going to be called Colectivo, which means collective.
Well, we're wrapping things up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.